My name is Rebecca. I'm 36 active duty, and I've learned that there are two different ways people look at you when you walk into a room. One is the look you get on base direct, clear, respectful. The other is the look you get at home, where people think history gives them permission. I felt the second one the moment we pulled into my parents' driveway in Ohio, the tires crunching over frost while Christmas lights blinked like they were trying too hard. I'd just wrapped a long stretch of work. Not deployment, but close enough to feel it in my shoulders. I was tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. Still, I told myself this trip mattered. My kid had been counting down the days. He'd packed his small backpack himself and checked it twice like he was afraid something important might be left behind. He kept asking if Grandma would like the picture he drew. I said yes, because that's what you say when you want a child to feel safe about where they're going. Inside the house smelled the same as always. Cinnamon old carpet, something fried earlier in the day. My mom greeted me with a sideways hug, the kind you give someone when your hands are already busy. She crouched in front of my kid and asked if he remembered her. He nodded politely and handed her the picture. She smiled the way people do when a stranger hands them a flyer they don't want, but don't know how to refuse. My dad gave a quick glance, then turned to shake my hand like we were at a conference. I didn't say anything. I never do at first. Years in uniform teach you to watch before you speak. You notice who looks at whom, who asks questions, who doesn't. My sister was already there, sitting at the table with her phone face down, like she wanted to look present without actually being present. She glanced up, smiled at me, then looked past my kid as if he were a coat we'd hung by the door. Her daughter was on the couch swinging her legs, the band in her hair crooked from running around. She looked comfortable, like she belonged. We set our bags down. I lined the wrapped gifts by the tree. Each one had a small drawing taped to the top because my kid insisted. He'd worked on them all week, asking which colors people liked. I watched him hover near the living room, trying to figure out where he fit. That's the thing people miss. Kids don't need explanations. They read rooms better than adults. Breakfast came and went. Plates clinked. Someone made a joke about the weather. My mom asked me how work was, then answered her own question by talking about a neighbor's roof. My sister laughed at something on her phone. My kid sat on the rug with a toy car he'd brought from home, rolling it back and forth, humming under his breath. He wasn't loud. He never is in houses that aren't ours. I found myself in this kitchen rinsing a mug that didn't need rinsing just to have something to do with my hands. I'd done this before. Every holiday, every birthday. I told myself the same story each time. They don't mean anything by it. They're just awkward. It'll get better as he gets older. People need time. 5 years is a lot of time. There had been other moments small enough to explain away if you wanted to. The way my mom introduced him to friends without using the word grandson. The way my dad asked about school but never waited for the answer. The way my sister talked about her kids' milestones in detail, then said, "And how's everything?" when it was my turn. Nothing you could point to and call cruel, just enough to keep a line drawn. I tried to bridge it. I always did. Extra visits when my schedule allowed. Photos sent ahead of holidays. Reminders about favorite snacks. I told myself this was what family meant, meeting people where they were even when where they were wasn't great. In the living room, my sister's daughter hopped off the couch and wandered over to the rug. She stood there for a second, hands on her hips, studying my kid like she was trying to solve a puzzle. He looked up, smiled, and made room for her car. She didn't sit. She tilted her head instead, the way kids do when they're about to say something important because an adult said it was true. I felt a tightening in my chest, not panic, recognition. It's the same feeling you get when a briefing goes quiet, and you know the next line matters. I stepped closer without meaning to. No one else moved. My sister watched from the table, her mouth already curling into a smile that told me she expected entertainment. My mom lifted her teacup. My dad stared at the television, which was on, but muted. The house had that specific holiday hush, the kind that feels peaceful until you realize it's just people waiting. My kid set his car down carefully. He looked up again, eyes open, trusting. He was good at that. He still believed words were meant to help, I don't remember the music that was playing. I remember the angle of the light on the carpet. I remember thinking that this room had decided who mattered long before we walked in. And I remember how easy it would have been to interrupt, to smooth it over, to laugh, and redirect the way I'd done 100 times before in smaller ways. Instead, I stood there and listened already, aware that whatever happened next would tell me exactly how this day was going to go, not just for me, but for the kid, standing on that rug, waiting for someone to show him where he belonged. The air felt warmer the closer I stood to the rug, like the heat from the vent had shifted without warning, and I found myself counting my breaths the way I do when a room gets loud, even though no one is talking. My kid's shoulders were relaxed, his fingers steady on the toy car, and I watched the small choices people made around him as if they were notes in a report I didn't want to write but couldn't ignore. This wasn't new. It never is when something finally shows itself clearly. It's usually been rehearsed for years. I'd seen it in the pauses, in how my sister corrected her daughter when she used the wrong fork, but never corrected her when she said things like real cousins or our side of the family. In how those phrases floated through the room and landed somewhere behind my kid's ear quiet enough that adults pretended not to hear them. Kids hear everything. Adults choose what counts. A few summers back, we were at a backyard cookout. The kids were chasing each other through the sprinkler while the adults hovered near the grill. My sister had handed out popsicles and said, "Okay, make sure everyone gets one." Then she leaned toward her daughter and added, not whispering, just lowering her voice, "You know which ones are for family." She'd smiled when she said it like it was a joke we were all supposed to get. I'd told myself she meant cousins who were sleeping over or kids from next door. I'd told myself a lot of things. There was the time at my parents' house when my mom lined up school pictures on the mantel. My sister's kids went in the center. My kid's photo ended up near the end, half hidden behind a candle. I moved it without saying anything. It was back where it started the next day. No one commented. That's how it always worked. Nothing direct. Nothing you could quote. Just enough to teach a lesson without taking responsibility for it. My sister was good at that. She never raised her voice. She never picked fights. She let other people do the work for her by saying nothing at the right moments. Watching her now, I recognize the same calm patience she used when she wanted something to sink in. She didn't interrupt her daughter because she didn't need to. The idea had already been planted. I tried to counter it in ways that felt reasonable. I used names. I said your cousin when others said the kids. I made a point of asking my kid questions out loud so he wouldn't disappear into the background. I praised him for small things, tying his shoes, remembering manners, because I wanted him to know he was seen. None of it stuck the way I hoped. It's hard to compete with repetition. At night after visits like this, he'd ask questions that didn't sound like questions. Why does Aunt Angela say her kids are the real ones, or Grandpa likes them more because they're older, right? I answered carefully. I said families look different. I said love isn't a contest. I said grown-ups make mistakes. What I didn't say was that some people protect their version of family by shrinking everyone else. Back in the living room, my sister shifted her weight and crossed her arms, still smiling, still waiting. My mom took a sip of tea like she needed a second to swallow. My dad cleared his throat and said something about the weather, like it was his job to keep things moving along. No one stepped in. No one ever did. Silence had become a shared language. I'd learned to read that language somewhere between basic training and my first real assignment. When people avoid eye contact, when they change the subject, when they let a bad thing stand because correcting it would be uncomfortable, in uniform silence can get someone hurt. At home, it just gets passed down. My kid rolled the car toward his cousin again, hopeful. She didn't take it. She looked past him, instead, checking her mother's face the way kids do when they want confirmation. My sister gave the smallest nod. It was barely there, but it was enough. That's how instructions are given when you don't want to be blamed for them. I thought about the first time my sister reacted badly to the adoption. She hadn't yelled or argued. She just said, "That's a lot to take on," and asked if I was sure I wanted to do it alone. Later, when paperwork stretched on and visits were supervised, and nothing moved fast, she told people I was being generous. Not brave, Not committed. Generous. Like I was lending something I could take back if it got inconvenient. Over time, her comments shifted. You know it's not the same, she said once, stirring sugar into her coffee. Blood matters to some people. She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't have to. She'd already decided where she stood. I'd countered with facts. Stability, consistency, love. The things that actually build families. She countered with tone, with implication, with repetition. Kids don't argue with that. They absorb it. My kid glanced up at me just for a second. Not scared. Just checking. It was the same look he gave me when he crossed a busy street or tried something new at school. Are you here? Are we okay? I gave him a nod without smiling, the kind that says yes without making a show of it. I could feel the weight of all the times I'd stayed quiet, to keep the peace pressing down on that moment. All the holidays I'd told myself this was temporary. All the drives home where I replayed conversations and rewrote them in my head. I'd treated this like a problem that needed patience, like time would do the work if I didn't rush it. Across the room, my sister's daughter shifted her stance, clearly waiting for a reaction. That's another thing kids learn fast. When to pause. When to push. She hadn't come up with this on her own. She was delivering something she'd been told was true. The house felt smaller than it had when we walked in. The lights were too bright. The tree looked crowded with ornaments that didn't belong to us. I realized how practiced everyone was at pretending nothing was wrong, and how that pretense depended on me playing along. My kid picked up the car and set it beside his knee, careful, deliberate. He didn't cry. He didn't laugh it off. He waited. I watched my sister lean back in her chair, satisfied, in a way that had nothing to do with Christmas. My mom's spoon clinked softly against her cup. My dad reached for the remote again. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't reach for explanations. I didn't look at my sister at all. I looked at my kid and felt something settle into place. Not anger, not sadness, but a clear understanding of what this room had been teaching him every time we visited. And standing there with the heat still pressing against my skin and the quiet stretching just a little too long, I made a decision that didn't need to be announced to be real. The words landed softly, almost casually, and for a split second I wondered if I'd misheard them the way you sometimes do when a sentence doesn't fit the room it's spoken in. My sister's daughter stood there with her hands at her sides, chin lifted, repeating something she'd been told was important enough to share. Grandma said you're not real family. She didn't shout it. She didn't whisper. She said it the way kids repeat rules, steady and certain, like she was explaining how things worked. My kid blinked once slow, like his brain was catching up before his body did. He didn't look at her right away. He looked at the car in his hand, instead turning it over as if the answer might be printed on the bottom. The room didn't react the way it should have. No sharp intake of breath. No quick correction. No adult voice stepping in to say that wasn't okay. My sister made a small sound that might have been a laugh if you wanted to be generous. It came out light, amused, like she'd just heard a clever joke and was waiting for the rest of us to appreciate it. My mom lifted her teacup again. My dad stared harder at the television, still muted, the weather ticker crawling along the bottom of the screen. Someone shifted in their chair. That was it. That was the response. My kid set the car down carefully on the rug. He didn't throw it. He didn't push it away. He just placed it there, hands flat on his knees, and lowered his eyes to the floor. It was the kind of stillness you don't teach a child. It's the kind they learn when they don't feel safe asking questions. I felt something tighten in my chest, not sharp enough to hurt, just enough to make it hard to breathe all the way in. I looked at my sister. She was watching her daughter now, pleased, like she'd just seen a lesson delivered correctly. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The message had already done its work. I waited. That's what I do when something goes wrong. I give people a second to fix it. 1 second turned into 2, then 3. My mom took another sip of tea. My dad reached for the remote, turned the volume up a notch, and said, "Looks like it might snow later," as if the weather had just become more urgent than what was happening on the rug. No one corrected her. Not the grandmother whose words had been borrowed. Not the aunt who'd been smiling through it. Not the adults who liked to talk about family values when it suited them. The silence sat there heavy and deliberate, and my kid absorbed it without making a sound. He didn't cry. That might have been easier. He didn't ask why. That would have given someone an opening to soften it. He just stared at the carpet shoulders slightly hunched, like he was trying to make himself smaller without anyone noticing. I knew that posture. I'd seen it on base when someone realized they'd misjudged a room. When they understood the rules had changed without being told. It's the posture of someone trying not to draw attention while everything inside them recalibrates. My sister's daughter shifted her weight, clearly expecting more. Maybe laughter. Maybe agreement. She glanced at her mother again, checking in. My sister met her eyes and gave the faintest nod, barely visible but enough. Confirmation received. I could have spoken then. I could have corrected it for everyone. I could have said the words that were apparently too hard for the rest of them to manage. He is family. That's not okay. We don't talk like that. The phrases lined up easily in my head. I use my voice for a living. I'm not shy, but I also knew how this would play out if I did. The backpedaling. The excuses. She didn't mean it like that. Kids say things. You're being sensitive. The conversation would turn into a debate about tone instead of what was said. My kid would sit there listening to adults argue over whether his place in the family was worth defending. I wasn't willing to make him sit through that. I took a step forward, then another, not toward my sister, not toward my parents, but toward my kid. I knelt beside him and rested a hand on his back. He didn't lean into it, but he didn't pull away either. His breathing was shallow. I matched it without thinking, slow and steady the way I do when I'm grounding myself. Hey, I said quietly, not to correct, not to explain, just to let him know I was there. My sister let out a soft laugh, then the kind that pretends nothing serious has happened. Kid's right, she said like that, wrapped everything up neatly. Like this was a moment to be smoothed over instead of addressed. No one disagreed with her. No one agreed either. They just let it hang there unfinished and ugly. I stood up slowly. I didn't look around the room again. I didn't need to. I already knew what I'd see. The same faces avoiding responsibility. The same people waiting for me to carry it. My kid picked up his car again, hesitating for a beat before standing. He looked at me, searching my face, and I gave him a nod. Not a smile. Not reassurance I couldn't back up in that room. Just a clear signal. We're moving. I reached for our coats without saying anything. My sister raised an eyebrow, still amused. You're not seriously upset about that, are you? She asked like she was testing a theory. I didn't answer. I helped my kid into his jacket, zipped it up, tucked his scarf the way he liked. My mom finally set her cup down. Rebecca, she said, cautious now. Let's not make a big deal out of... I didn't let her finish. Not by interrupting, by continuing what I was already doing. I gathered the gifts we'd brought, stacking them carefully, the drawings still taped to the top. My kid watched me quiet, observant. He didn't ask what was happening. He just followed my lead the way he always does when he trusts me to handle something he doesn't understand yet. My sister scoffed softly. Wow, she said. Talk about dramatic. I picked up the last bag and turned toward the door. The house felt louder than even with the television still playing weather updates and holiday ads. I could feel eyes on my back waiting for me to explain myself, to justify why I wasn't willing to sit there and pretend. I didn't explain. I didn't justify. I opened the door and let the cold air rush in sharp and clean. My kid stepped outside first, the frost crunching under his shoes. I followed, pulling the door closed behind us with a firmness that didn't require slamming. As we walked to the car, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't check it. I focused on getting my kid buckled in, on making sure his hands were warm, on starting the engine and pulling away from the curb without looking back. The house grew smaller in the rear-view mirror lights, blinking steadily unchanged. Inside the car, the heater kicked on, and my kid stared out the window, quiet but composed. I adjusted the mirror, took a breath. I hadn't realized I'd been holding, and drove already aware that the silence we'd left behind was going to be filled whether I participated in it or not. The heater hummed as we merged onto the road, and I turned it down a notch when I noticed my kid's cheeks had gone red the way they do when he's holding something in. He didn't ask where we were going. He didn't ask why we left. He watched the houses slide past the window, one string of lights after another, like he was counting them to stay busy. I kept both hands on the wheel, not because the road was slick, but because it gave me something solid to hold on to. I've learned that silence in a car can mean a lot of things. This one felt careful, like he didn't want to say the wrong thing. We stopped at a red light near the edge of town. A truck pulled up beside us. Music loud, windows fogged. I glanced over at my kid. He was staring at his reflection in the glass eyes, unfocused lips pressed together. I reached over and adjusted his scarf where it had twisted a small, ordinary movement. He let me. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said suddenly, not looking at me. I know I said steady. I didn't add anything else. He didn't need a speech. He needed confirmation. The light changed. I drove. Back at the hotel, I carried the bags in one by one, while he unlocked the door with the key card, like it was a game. Inside the room smelled faintly of cleaner and something sweet from the lobby. I set the gifts on the table without unwrapping them, the drawings still taped in place. They looked out of context, their bright paper against neutral walls. My kid climbed onto the bed and kicked off his shoes. He lay back, staring at the ceiling. "Are we in trouble?" he asked, quiet. "No," I said. "We're done for today." That seemed to be enough. He rolled onto his side and reached for his backpack, pulling out the stuffed animal he'd packed himself. He hugged it close, breathing slowing the way it does when his body decides it's safe again. I watched him for a moment longer than necessary, then went to the bathroom and turned on the sink just to have some noise. I splashed water on my face and looked at myself in the mirror. I didn't look angry. I didn't look shaken. I looked tired in a way that felt earned. The kind of tired that comes after you stop carrying something heavy. My phone buzzed on the counter. I picked it up this time, my sister. A text with a laughing emoji I didn't bother interpreting. "Seriously, you're leaving over that?" I didn't respond. Another buzz. My mom. "Rebecca, call me." I set the phone face down and leaned against the counter. In uniform, I'm trained to respond quickly. At home, I've learned that not responding is sometimes the clearest answer. When I came back into the room, my kid was sitting up flipping through channels. He stopped on a cartoon and turned the volume low. "Can we stay here tonight?" he asked, like he already knew the answer but wanted to hear it anyway. "Yes," I said. "We're staying." He nodded, satisfied, and turned back to the screen. I sat in the chair by the window and watched the parking lot for a bit. Snow had started to fall light and steady, catching in the glow of the street lamps. Cars came and went. No one knew what had just happened in a living room 10 minutes away. The world kept moving. Another text came through, this time from my dad. "Let's not make this bigger than it is." I almost laughed. Bigger than it is. Like what had happened was a misunderstanding, a slip of the tongue, something that would shrink if ignored. I typed a response, then deleted it. I didn't want to argue about size. I wanted to change the shape of things. Later, after my kid fell asleep with the TV still murmuring softly, I sat on the edge of the bed and thought through what I knew. Not what I felt. What I knew. I knew that what had been said wasn't new. I knew that the silence afterward wasn't accidental. I knew that every time I smoothed things over, I taught everyone involved that it was safe to keep going. I also knew something else, something I'd been avoiding because it made things complicated. For years, I'd been the quiet fix, the one who covered shortfalls without announcing it, the one who didn't mind picking up a bill or handling a repair because it seemed easier than watching my parents stress. It had felt like support. Somewhere along the way, it had become expectation. My phone buzzed again. A message from my mom, this time longer, more careful. "We love you. Let's talk tomorrow." I stared at the words until they blurred. Love without action doesn't hold much weight. Neither does talk that always ends the same way. I stood and gathered the gifts again, stacking them neatly in the corner. For a moment, I considered unwrapping one, letting my kid open it here, salvaging some piece of the day. I decided against it. I didn't want to pretend this was just a detour. I wanted it to be exactly what it was. I sat back down and opened my laptop. Not to write an email, not to vent. I pulled up our accounts instead. The ones I checked out of habit more than necessity. Numbers are calming. They tell the truth without tone. I scrolled through transactions, familiar patterns standing out now that I was looking for them. The automatic payment I'd set up years ago and never revisited. The transfers that lined up neatly with my parents' deadlines. Nothing illegal. Nothing dramatic. Just steady support that had quietly become structural. I closed the laptop and leaned back, listening to my kid's breathing even out across the room. He shifted in his sleep and mumbled something unintelligible, then settled again. The room felt still in a way that didn't demand anything from me. My phone buzzed one last time. A message from my mom, shorter now. "Please don't do this." I didn't answer. I set the phone on the table beside the gifts and turned off the lamp. In the dark, with the snow still falling outside and the heater cycling on and off, I let myself acknowledge a simple fact without dressing it up. Walking out hadn't been a reaction. It had been a choice. And choices once made have a way of arranging everything that comes after them. The laptop screen glowed faintly as I reopened it, the fan whirring just loud enough to remind me it was there, and I scrolled past numbers I usually skimmed without thinking. This time I slowed down, not to second-guess myself, but to see things as they were, stripped of the story I'd been telling myself for years. The pattern was obvious once I stopped pretending it wasn't. There was the automatic payment that went out every month on the same day, labeled blandly enough that it barely registered anymore. There were the transfers timed just before deadlines, utilities, insurance, the kind of expenses that don't forgive lateness. I'd set most of them up during a rough patch my parents had gone through a few years back. At the time, it felt temporary. A bridge. Something a daughter did when she could. I'd never announced it. I didn't want thanks. I didn't want leverage. I wanted stability. That's how I justified it anyway. In the military, support is clear. It's documented. It has an end date. At home, I'd let it blur. I told myself that was kindness. My phone buzzed again on the table. I ignored it and kept reading. One payment led to another, then another. A second mortgage I hadn't asked too many questions about. A repair bill that never seemed to end. It wasn't extravagant. It was just constant. I realized I'd been holding the floor steady under a house that kept shifting its weight. I closed the laptop and rubbed my eyes. In the other bed, my kid rolled over, tugged the blanket higher and sighed like he was settling into something comfortable. I stayed where I was, listening to that sound, letting it anchor me. The next morning, the hotel coffee tasted burnt, but it was hot, and that counted for something. My kid sat across from me at the small table, swinging his legs and tearing open a packet of sugar with more enthusiasm than necessary. He looked normal, lighter, like the night hadn't lodged itself in his chest the way I'd feared. "Can we get pancakes?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "We can." That was the first real decision of the day, and it felt good to say it without checking with anyone else. Back in the room while he brushed his teeth, I picked up my phone. Missed calls. Texts stacked on top of each other now. My sister's messages had shifted from joking to annoyed. My mom's had gone from worried to clipped. My dad hadn't texted again. He preferred emails when he wanted to sound reasonable. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I opened my banking app again and went straight to the payment settings. The cursor hovered for a second over the automatic transfer. I wasn't angry. I wasn't shaking. I was precise. I turned it off. The confirmation screen popped up, neutral and unemotional. Change saved. That was it. No fireworks, no alarm bells. Just a quiet adjustment that would ripple outward whether anyone liked it or not. We checked out before noon. The drive home was uneventful, the kind of long stretch of highway that lets your thoughts line up without crashing into each other. My kid fell asleep with his forehead pressed to the window, leaving a faint fog mark I wiped away at the next stop. He slept like someone who didn't feel watched. My phone rang as we pulled back onto the road. My mom. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again 15 minutes later. Same number. I declined it this time. By the time we stopped for gas, a voicemail notification blinked on the screen. I didn't listen to it yet. I paid at the pump, watched the numbers climb, and thought about how much energy it took to keep other people comfortable at the expense of clarity. We were an hour from home when my phone buzzed with a text that didn't bother with pleasantries. Did you change something with the account? It was from my mom. No context, no concern, just assumption. I pulled over at the next rest stop and put the car in park. My kid stirred, blinked at me, then went back to sleep when he saw we weren't getting out yet. I picked up my phone and typed carefully, not because I was afraid of saying the wrong thing, but because I wanted there to be no confusion. Yes, I wrote. We're not covering expenses anymore. The response came faster than I expected. What do you mean anymore? I watched the typing bubble appear and disappear twice before the next message landed. This is a mistake. We can't have things cut off. There it was. Not are you okay, not what happened. Just we can't. I took a breath and replied, it's not a mistake. A pause followed. Longer this time. I imagined her at a counter somewhere, card in hand line forming behind her, trying to keep her voice calm. The image didn't make me feel guilty. It made me tired. I can't believe you'd do this to your own family, she wrote finally. I looked at my kid in the rearview mirror. He'd shifted again, one arm flung over the pillow I'd wedged against the door. His face was soft, unguarded. He wasn't bracing for anyone's reaction. I'm not doing anything to you, I typed back. I'm making a change. The reply was immediate. This is about last night, isn't it? You're overreacting. Overreacting. The word people use when they don't want to look at cause and effect. I didn't answer that one. I put the phone down and started the car. We pulled back onto the highway, the rest stop shrinking behind us, the road stretching clean and open ahead. When we got home, I carried the bags inside and set them down by the door. My kid kicked off his shoes and headed straight for the kitchen, asking if we still had cereal. We did. Life resumed its shape easily when no one was pulling at the edges. Later that afternoon, my dad's email came through, formatted neatly, subject line neutral. I didn't open it right away. I put on a load of laundry instead, listening to the washer fill the mundane sound grounding me. When I finally did read it, the tone was exactly what I expected. Concerned. Disappointed. A reminder of everything they'd done for me growing up. A warning about making decisions based on emotion. A final line suggesting I think carefully before letting things go too far. I closed the email without responding and set the phone down on the counter. The house was quiet, except for the hum of appliances and my kid's voice drifting in from the living room as he narrated a game to himself. The space felt stable, uncomplicated. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cruel. I felt aligned. Like something that had been off for a long time had finally been adjusted back into place, and everything else was still in the process of catching up. The dryer buzzed as I pulled warm clothes out and folded them straight from the basket, the routine settling my hands even as my phone kept lighting up on the counter. I didn't look at it right away. I knew the rhythm by then. Silence from me made people louder. It always had. By evening, the messages had shifted tone. My sister stopped pretending this was a misunderstanding and moved straight into accusation. So this is what you're doing now, she wrote. Punishing mom and dad because a kid said something stupid. I read it once and set the phone back down. The way she framed it mattered. Not what was said. Not who heard it. Just that it inconvenienced her. An hour later, she tried again. You're really choosing someone else's child over your own family. There it was. The line she'd been circling for years finally said out loud. I didn't feel shocked. I felt oddly relieved. It's easier to respond to clarity than implication. My kid sat at the kitchen table, coloring quietly, his tongue poking out the corner of his mouth as he concentrated. He held up the page to show me a crooked house with a tall roof and a stick figure standing in the doorway. That's us, he said, proud. It looks solid, I said. He smiled and went back to work. I picked up my phone and typed back to my sister, keeping it short. This isn't about punishment. She responded immediately. Then what is it about? I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because she didn't want one. She wanted an opening. The next message came from my mom, longer this time, carefully worded. We're really struggling, Rebecca. We didn't plan for this. We're not asking for much. Just until things even out. Even out. Like the ground had shifted on its own. I stared at the screen, thinking about how often I'd heard that phrase. How often temporary had stretched into permanent. I typed deleted, then typed again. I'm not able to help financially anymore. Her reply came slower, as if she were choosing her words. I don't understand how you can do this. I almost laughed at that. Understanding had never been the problem. That night after my kid went to bed, my brother called. We weren't especially close, but we weren't distant either. His voice sounded tight, like he was bracing for something. They called me, he said, without preamble. I leaned against the counter and waited. They're behind on the second mortgage, he continued. Months. They tried to refinance, but their credit's shot. Now they're scrambling. I pictured the house I'd grown up in, the one I'd been quietly stabilizing from a distance. What did you say? I asked. I said no, he replied. I told them I can't fix this. I won't. There was a pause on the line. I don't blame you, you know. I just wanted you to know what's coming. I thanked him and hung up, feeling the shape of things sharpen. This wasn't panic. This was exposure. The safety net had been cut, and everyone standing on it was starting to notice. The next morning, my dad's email arrived, longer and more formal than the last. Bullet points. Concerns. A reminder of sacrifices they'd made for me growing up. A suggestion that my work and my current priorities might be clouding my judgment. Halfway through, he pivoted. I'm worried about you, he wrote. This doesn't sound like you. You seem isolated. I read that line twice. Isolated. The word landed exactly where it was meant to. If I wasn't cooperating, something must be wrong with me. He ended with a warning dressed up as advice. When this blows over, and it will, don't burn bridges you might need later. I closed the email and deleted it. No response. No rebuttal. Nothing for him to argue with. By the end of the week, the calls started coming from other directions. An aunt I barely spoke to left a voicemail saying she'd heard things were tense and hoped I'd reconsider. A family friend messaged on social media offering prayers and asking if I was okay. The story was spreading, edited carefully to cast me as the unreasonable one. I didn't correct it. I didn't defend myself. I watched how quickly concern turned into pressure when money was involved. One afternoon, my sister showed up at my door without warning. I saw her car pull into the driveway and felt my shoulders tighten automatically. I didn't rush to open the door. I checked on my kid first. He was in his room building something out of blocks, humming softly. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. She crossed her arms and sighed like I'd exhausted her already. This has gone far enough, she said. You're hurting people. I'm not, I replied. I'm stopping something. She shook her head. You always do this. You make things dramatic, then act like you're the only one being reasonable. I looked at her, really looked. At the confidence with which she said it. At how comfortable she was speaking for everyone else. You're upset because things changed, I said. That doesn't mean they're wrong. Her mouth tightened. Mom's crying herself to sleep, she said. Is that what you want? No, I said. But I'm not fixing it for you. She stared at me for a moment, then laughed sharp and disbelieving. You think you can just walk away from family like this? I already did, I said. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. For the first time, she looked unsure. Not hurt. Not apologetic. Just unsure. The conversation wasn't going where she expected. You're making a mistake, she said finally. Maybe, I replied, but it's mine. She left without saying goodbye. I went back inside and locked the door, the click sounding louder than it should have. In the kitchen, my kid looked up from his blocks. Was that Aunt Angela? He asked. Yes, I said. He nodded and went back to what he was doing, apparently satisfied. The simplicity of it made my chest loosen a little. That night, as I turned off lights and checked locks, my phone buzzed again. A message from my mom, short now, stripped of softness. We need help. I set the phone down and stood there for a moment, listening to the house settle around me. No alarms, no raised voices, just the steady, ordinary quiet of a place that wasn't negotiating its worth. I noticed it first in the way the house stayed quiet, even when my phone didn't. The walls didn't feel tense. The air didn't feel heavy. Whatever chaos was happening elsewhere wasn't following me inside anymore, and that contrast made certain things impossible to ignore. My brother called again 2 days later, later than usual, his voice low, like he didn't want anyone overhearing. They're talking to people now, he said. Not banks. Other options. I didn't ask what that meant. I already knew. They're trying to buy time, he added. They keep saying this is temporary. That once you calm down, things will go back to normal. Normal. The word sat there plain and misleading. I pictured my mom using it like a shield, my sister like a weapon. After we hung up, I opened my laptop again, not to check accounts this time, but to look through old emails and documents I'd archived without much thought. The adoption paperwork, school forms, emergency contacts, everything that had required my signature over the last few years. My parents' names appeared exactly once, and that was because I'd filled it in myself, hoping it meant something. What I found instead were messages from my dad asking if I could help, just this once repeated often enough to form a pattern. Messages from my mom thanking me for stepping in, always framed like I was covering a gap they couldn't be expected to manage. Messages from my sister asking if I could float them until tax season, then again until summer, then again until something else worked out. None of them asked how I was doing. None of them asked how my kid was handling anything. The questions were always about timing, about amounts, about what I could do. The realization wasn't dramatic. It didn't hit all at once. It settled in slowly like a truth that had been waiting for me to stop looking away. I wasn't their daughter in the way I'd thought. I was their solution, their fallback, the person who made consequences optional. That night while my kid worked on homework at the kitchen table, I made dinner without rushing. He asked me to quiz him on spelling words, and I did, correcting him when he missed one, praising him when he didn't. He grinned when he got the hard ones right. It struck me how clear expectations made him calmer, not anxious. How knowing the rules helped him relax. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my mom calling instead of texting. I let it ring. She called back 5 minutes later. I let it ring again. The third time I answered, her voice sounded tired. Not fragile. Tired in the way people get when their plan isn't working. "Rebecca," she said, like she was relieved to hear me. "We need to talk." "I'm listening," I replied. She launched into it immediately. Bills, deadlines, how hard things had been lately. She didn't mention Christmas. She didn't mention my kid. She talked about stress and pressure and how unfair everything felt. I waited until she paused for breath. "What do you want from me?" I asked. There was a beat of silence. "We just need some guidance," she said carefully. "Maybe you could help us figure out next steps." "You're good at that." Guidance. Not help, not money. Just guidance. The word was a disguise. "Who are you talking to about this?" I asked. She hesitated. "Your father reached out to someone who helped when the bank said no," she admitted. "Just to explore options." Options. Another word that meant more than it said. "I'm not getting involved," I said. Her tone sharpened slightly. "You can't just abandon us." I felt something shift then, not anger, not guilt, but clarity. "I didn't abandon you," I said. "I stopped fixing things you don't want to fix yourselves." She started to argue, then stopped. "I don't understand why you're being like this." "I'm being consistent," I replied. She sighed long and heavy. "You've changed." "Yes," I said. "I have." After we hung up, I sat there for a moment longer than necessary, phone still in my hand. In the other room, my kid was humming while he brushed his teeth, the sound drifting down the hallway. It was ordinary, unremarkable. It mattered more than anything else in that moment. The next day, my dad showed up at my office. Not at my house, not with a call ahead of time. He showed up at my office where you don't just walk in. You check in. You wait. You explain who you are and why you're there. By the time security let me know he'd been sitting there long enough to make a point, I met him in the lobby. He looked smaller than I remembered, shoulders hunched, hands clasped, like he was trying to look concerned instead of desperate. "I was worried about you," he said, leading with it like a practiced line. "This isn't like you." We sat down across from each other, the chairs too close for comfort. He talked about family, about how people say things they don't mean, about forgiveness, about how stress makes everyone act out of character. I listened without interrupting. Then he shifted. "Have you thought about counseling?" he asked. "Someone neutral, to help you reconnect." Reconnect, as if I were the one who'd drifted. "I'm fine," I said. He nodded, then leaned in slightly. "You don't seem fine." The implication hung there. If I wasn't cooperating, something must be wrong with me. He slid his phone across the table. "We're just asking for direction," he said. Please don't let her make a decision that hurts everyone. I looked down at the screen. Bank statements, overdue notices, a warning about foreclosure on the second mortgage. At the bottom, a single line typed carefully. We're running out of time. They'd gone around me. They'd decided my boundary was a problem to be managed. I handed the phone back to him. You shouldn't be here, I said. His mouth tightened. I'm your father. And this isn't the place for this conversation, I replied. He stared at me for a long moment, then stood. You'll regret this, he said quietly. I watched him walk out, posture stiff, steps uneven. The lobby returned to its normal hum, people passing through with their own concerns. No one paid us any attention. Back at home that evening, I opened the hall closet and pulled out the bin I kept on the top shelf. Inside were things I didn't store anywhere else. The blanket my kid came home with. The first drawing he'd ever labeled with my name. Notes from teachers folded and refolded until the edges softened. I sat on the floor and went through them one by one, not to relive anything but to remind myself what I was actually responsible for. Family doesn't show up at your workplace to undermine you when money runs out. Family doesn't treat a child like a variable in a negotiation. I put everything back and closed the bin, the lid clicking into place. In the kitchen, my kid was setting the table without being asked, counting out forks with serious concentration. I watched him for a moment, then reached for my laptop, already knowing what needed to be said and how little of it actually required explanation. The cursor blinked at the top of a blank email. While I stood at the counter, the hum of the refrigerator steady enough to keep my thoughts from scattering. I typed a sentence, deleted it, typed another, then closed the laptop without sending anything. I didn't need to explain myself again. I needed to be precise. For a few days after my dad showed up at my office, things went quiet. Not the tense quiet I was used to. A different kind. No calls, no texts, no forwarded messages from relatives who suddenly felt called to intervene. I noticed the absence the way you notice a headache finally easing carefully like you don't want to jinx it. Then the picture arrived. It came through as a text from my mom unannounced. My parents stood outside a small brick church I didn't recognize, hands clasped, faces solemn. They looked like they were posing for a brochure. The caption read, "We've started counseling. We're trying. Please don't give up on us." I stared at the screen longer than I meant to. The photo was well lit, framed, deliberate, not a snapshot, a statement. My kid was at the table working through a puzzle pieces spread out with methodical care. "Can you help me find the corner ones?" he asked without looking up. In a minute, I said, setting the phone down face up. I didn't reply to the message. I didn't delete it either. I let it sit where I could see it like evidence. That night after bedtime, I pulled the phone back out. A second message had come through, longer this time. My mom wrote about uncomfortable conversations and hard truths, about downsizing and cutting back, about faith. She mentioned my kid by name and wrote, "We realize now we saw him as a symbol of your choices, not as a person. That's on us." The sentence landed hard enough to knock the air out of me. It was the first time anyone had named the harm without deflecting it. I didn't feel relieved. I felt cautious. I showed the messages to my brother the next day. He read them quietly, then handed the phone back. "They sound sincere," he said. "But they always do when things get tight." I thought about that on my drive home, traffic moving smoothly, radio low. Sincere is a tone. Change is behavior. For a week, nothing else happened. No pressure, no follow-ups, no attempts to pull me back in. I let myself believe just a little that maybe they were doing the work without expecting immediate results. That maybe space was actually space. Then my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. "Hi, Rebecca," the text read. "This is Marlene from your mom's church group. She mentioned you might want to reconnect sometime. No pressure, just reaching out." I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the screen. I hadn't shared my number with anyone new. I hadn't mentioned reconnecting. I hadn't said anything at all. I didn't respond. The next day, another message arrived, this one more official. A youth coordinator from the same church inviting my kid to weekend activities. She wrote that my mom thought he might enjoy making friends his age. My chest tightened. I hadn't given permission for anyone to contact my child. I hadn't given permission for my parents to share his name. I called the church that afternoon. I kept my voice calm, polite. I thanked them for thinking of us and declined the invitation. Then I asked a simple question. How did you get my contact information? There was a pause on the other end of the line, just long enough to answer without saying anything. Your mother shared it, the coordinator said finally. She said you were open to reconnecting and just needed encouragement. Encouragement. Another soft word doing heavy work. I ended the call and sat in my car, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting the anger rise without pushing it down. This wasn't outreach. It was strategy. When direct access failed, they found another door. At home, my kid ran up to me with a drawing, breathless with excitement. Look, he said, holding it up. 3 stick figures, a dog, a house with a tall roof. No grandparents, no extended family, just certainty. That's great, I said, and meant it. That night I opened my laptop again. This time I wrote the email. It was short, direct, no emotion. I stated that we would not be meeting, that they were not to contact my child directly or indirectly, that involving third parties was a violation of the boundary I'd set, that any further attempts would be documented and addressed formally. I ended with one line. You made your choice at the table. I read it once, then sent it. There was no reply. A week later, an envelope appeared in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a photo of a small apartment, secondhand furniture, boxes stacked along the wall. A handwritten note said they'd sold the house and moved. No expectations. Just wanted me to know they were starting over. I set the photo on the counter and left it there while I made dinner. My kid asked what it was. Just a picture, I said. That night after dishes were done and the house settled, I wrote back. I told them I got the photo, that I respected the steps they were taking, that we weren't ready to include them in our lives. Not now. Maybe one day. If the work was real, it would continue without us watching. I pressed send and waited. The silence that followed felt different. It wasn't charged. It wasn't performative. It just existed. And for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to fill it. Weeks passed. Life found a rhythm that didn't include them. Mornings were backpacks and missing socks. Evenings were homework and dinner and stories before bed. I noticed how much energy I'd been spending anticipating reactions instead of living my own days. Then, just as that quiet started to feel reliable, my phone buzzed again. Another number I didn't recognize. A message from someone who introduced herself as a friend of my mom's, checking in, hoping I was well. I set the phone down and watched my kid line up his shoes by the door without being asked, focused and content. The pattern was clear now, clear enough that I didn't need to question it. When one approach failed, another took its place, dressed up as concern framed as kindness. I opened my laptop not to argue, not to explain, but to make sure every boundary I'd drawn was recorded exactly as it stood ready to hold without reinforcement steady enough to do the work on its own. The phone vibrated against the counter while I was rinsing a plate, the sound sharp enough to cut through the running water, and I turned off the faucet before wiping my hands on a towel I'd already folded twice. I didn't check the screen right away. I watched my kid at the table instead, tongue tucked at the corner of his mouth, as he filled in a worksheet with careful block letters, completely unaware that anyone outside this room still thought they had a say. When I picked up the phone, the message was short and friendly, the kind that pretends familiarity where there is none. A first name I vaguely recognized from my mom's social circle, followed by a sentence about just wanting to make sure everything was okay and how she'd heard we might appreciate some community support. No mention of my parents. No mention of why she had my number. I set the phone down and finished drying the plate. 5 minutes later, another message arrived. This one was longer. It came from a group number tied to a local charity event inviting families to participate. My kid's name was included, spelled correctly. The invitation referenced interests I hadn't shared publicly. Soccer, drawing, pancakes on Saturdays. My chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with certainty. I didn't respond. I walked to the living room, picked up my laptop, and pulled up the document I'd started weeks earlier. Dates, times, screenshots, nothing dramatic, just facts. When you deal with patterns long enough, you learn that clarity is a form of protection. My kid slid the worksheet toward me. "Can you check this one?" he asked, pointing to a word he'd sounded out slowly. I leaned over, corrected a letter, and gave him a nod. "Looks good." He grinned and went back to work satisfied. I called the organization listed in the message and asked to speak to whoever had sent it. My voice stayed even. Polite. The woman on the other end apologized, immediately said she'd been told we were open to outreach. I asked where she'd gotten our contact information. She hesitated, then said my mother had provided it and assured them it was welcome. I thanked her for clarifying and ended the call. That night after bedtime, I laid everything out on the kitchen table. The church texts, the charity invitation, the earlier messages from friends of friends. It wasn't harassment in the legal sense. It didn't need to be. It was persistence wrapped in politeness, a refusal to accept no unless it came with consequences. I opened my email and wrote one more message. It wasn't long. I stated that I was aware of the third-party contacts, that sharing my child's information without consent was unacceptable, that any further attempts to reach us through intermediaries would be documented, that this was no longer a conversation. I sent it to my parents. I copied my sister. I didn't wait for a reply. The response came anyway faster than I expected. My sister texted first. "You're being paranoid," she wrote. "People are just trying to help." I didn't answer. Then my mom emailed. The tone was wounded now, less polished. She said she hadn't meant any harm, that she was only trying to rebuild trust, that I was making things impossible by refusing grace. Grace. The word felt heavy in my hands, like something borrowed and returned whenever it stopped being useful. My dad followed with a shorter message, businesslike. He said they respected my need for space and hoped I was doing well. Halfway through, he pivoted, asking if I was still considering investing in property and whether there might be a way to structure something that could help them through a rough patch. I read it twice, then I closed the laptop. The next attempt came from my sister again, late at night. "Everyone's hurting," she wrote. "Can't you just be the bigger person?" I deleted it without replying. The following week, a packet arrived in the mail addressed to me in my mom's handwriting. Inside were pamphlets from counselors, financial advisors, and support groups. The kind you pick up when you want to look proactive without committing to anything. A sticky note on top read, "We're doing the work." I recycled the whole stack. At school pickup one afternoon, my kid ran toward me with a paper clutched in his hand. "We did a family project," he said, breathless. I drew us. In the car, he showed me the worksheet. Boxes labeled Mother, Father, Family. He'd filled them in carefully. My name, his, a dog we don't own but talk about getting someday. When I asked if he wanted to add anyone else, he shook his head. "That's everyone," he said, then turned to look out the window. There was no hesitation in his voice, no question, just certainty. That evening, my sister tried one last time. A voice memo this time, her tone softer than before, carefully controlled. She said she missed me, that this had gone too far, that we could all sit down and clear the air if I'd just be reasonable. I didn't listen to it all the way through. I blocked her number. Then I blocked my parents. Email, phone, social media. I didn't announce it. I didn't warn anyone. I just closed the doors they kept trying to push open and locked them without checking to see who was on the other side. The house didn't change when I did it. The lights didn't flicker. The air didn't shift. My kid was in the living room, lining up action figures with serious focus, narrating a story only he could hear. I made dinner. We ate. We talked about school and what movie to watch later. After dishes, I sat on the couch with my laptop open, updating the document one last time. Final note added. No further contact. Boundaries enforced. I closed the file and shut the laptop, the click decisive. Outside the street was quiet neighbors going about their routines, unaware of the lines being drawn inside this house. When my kid climbed onto my lap and asked for a story, I wrapped an arm around him and started one we'd read a dozen times before. He listened relaxed, already drifting his breathing slow and even. I kept reading, my voice steady, the words familiar, and felt something settle into place that didn't require approval or agreement to hold. The morning settled into a rhythm without anyone announcing it, the kind that forms when there's nothing left to negotiate. I woke up before the alarm out of habit, made coffee and packed lunches, while the house stayed quiet in a comfortable way. My kid padded into the kitchen in mismatched socks, already talking about a science project and whether baking soda counted as a reaction. I listened, nodded, and handed him a plate without checking my phone first. That detail mattered more than it should have. On base, everything worked the way it always had. Clear expectations. Clear roles. I showed up, did the work, signed off, went home. No one asked me to justify my decisions. No one suggested counseling because I'd stopped cooperating. The contrast was sharp enough to be instructive. Outside our family bubble, boundaries weren't insults. They were standard. At home, the quiet held. Days passed without new numbers lighting up my screen. Weeks followed, then a month. I didn't check blocked messages. I didn't ask anyone for updates. News still found its way around when it wanted to. A cousin mentioned my parents were struggling with the smaller apartment. Someone else said church friends didn't quite understand the situation. My sister posted photos online with captions about togetherness that didn't name who was missing. I didn't comment. I didn't linger. My kid stopped asking questions I used to dread. He didn't ask who the drawings were for. He didn't look to my face after saying something, checking for a reaction. He filled his backpack in the morning and forgot it by the door in the afternoon, confident it would still be there. That kind of certainty doesn't come from speeches. It comes from consistency. One afternoon, he brought home a worksheet titled "I See My Family." He spread it out on the table and colored carefully, tongue tucked at the corner of his mouth. When he finished, he slid it over with pride. There we were. Him. Me. A dog we still didn't have. A house with a roof that didn't sag. When I asked if he wanted to add anyone else, he shook his head. That's everyone, he said, already reaching for his markers again. The answer didn't land like a loss. It landed like a fact. We started doing things because we wanted to, not because they were expected. Saturday mornings became pancakes shaped like whatever he could talk me into attempting. Fishing trips with borrowed gear. Evenings with homework at the table and music low in the background. I stopped bracing for the phone to ring. The house felt lighter, like a window had been cracked open and something stale had finally drifted out. Work sent me on a short training rotation. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to disrupt routine. We adjusted. I left notes on the fridge. He left drawings on the counter. When I came back, he ran down the hallway and nearly knocked me over, laughing hard enough to lose his balance. No one else needed to be there to make that moment complete. I thought about my parents once late at night. Not with anger, not even with sadness. With distance. I hoped the counseling stuck. I hoped the changes were real. I also knew that hope didn't require access. It didn't require me to reopen doors I'd closed with care. My sister tried again, briefly. A text from a new number that said she missed me and hoped we could talk. It didn't mention my kid. It didn't acknowledge anything that had happened. I didn't reply. Silence, I'd learned, can be an answer without being a punishment. We took a short trip to the mountains when school led out a place with tall trees and a porch that caught the afternoon light just right. My kid ran the trail ahead of me, pointing out rocks and birds like he was cataloging discoveries. At night, we sat by the fire and told stories that wandered off into laughter. No one asked who wasn't there. No one needed to. On the last morning, he drew us a picture. 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a house with smoke curling from the chimney. He added stars to the sky even though it was daytime. When I asked why, he shrugged. I like it better that way. I taped it to the fridge when we got home, right where I'd see it every day. I used to think family was something you endured, something you held together even when it cut into you. I don't think that anymore. Family is who protects your child's sense of belonging. Family is who doesn't ask them to earn love by staying quiet. Family is the place where doors don't open without permission and apologies don't arrive only after leverage fails. I don't know what my parents believe now. I don't know whether the counseling changed them or just taught them new language. I don't need to know. The need to know was the last thread, and letting it go felt like breathing after holding my lungs tight for years. The seasons turned without ceremony. Cooler mornings. Different light. My kids started waking up earlier, excited for school, talking about a class pet, and a project that involved vinegar. I adjusted my schedule so I could do drop-offs twice a week. We hosted friends for dinner and laughed loudly without scanning the room for disapproval. We built traditions that didn't require permission. There were moments when memory tried to intrude. A holiday display at the store. A church parking lot we passed on the way to the park. I let those moments pass without attaching meaning to them. I'd learned the difference between remembering and reopening. One honors what happened. The other hands power back. I didn't announce that we were done. I didn't write a final message to tie everything up neatly. The ending arrived quietly the way clarity does when it's been waiting its turn. One day I realized I hadn't checked blocked messages in weeks. Another day, I noticed the idea of running into them didn't tighten my chest anymore. Protecting my kid wasn't a reaction anymore. It was our life. When he ran into the kitchen one morning and asked if we could make heart-shaped pancakes, I reached for the pan without hesitation. The house smelled like coffee and batter. Outside, the day was ordinary in the best way. I flipped the pancake, watched it land just off-center, and smiled, already knowing that whatever else happened beyond these walls didn't get a vote here. I didn't walk away to teach anyone a lesson. I walked away because my child needed a place where belonging wasn't questioned, negotiated, or quietly taken away at a holiday table. Cutting contact didn't make me lighter overnight, but it made our days clearer. There was no more bracing, no more translating adult behavior for a kid who deserved better. In the end, the quiet wasn't empty. It was honest. And that honesty gave us room to grow into a family that didn't need approval to feel whole. If stories like this resonate with you, real family drama, quiet boundaries, and family revenge stories that don't rely on shouting or spectacle, consider subscribing to the channel. These are true-to-life revenge stories about choosing peace, protecting your kids, and walking away when staying costs too much. New stories like this come regularly, and you're always welcome here.